Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is my good friend Josh Goldberg. Josh Goldberg is a full-time open source maintainer specializing in TypeScript. He has written the book on TypeScript called Learning TypeScript. He also maintains the ESLint TypeScript plugin, as well as commits to the ESLint project. TypeScript, for those who aren't yet informed, is a superset of JavaScript, meaning it's almost the same as JavaScript, except it has static type analysis, meaning there's a little program that runs that validates the code you write and tells you if it's prone to errors or not. TypeScript is a great way to ship really safe code that you find out about if it works or not before your users do, because it will just not build if there's any errors. It does this using a type system, meaning you explicitly declare this is a number, that's a string. And then if you try to do something nonsensical, like do a conditional check, like if on a Boolean that's always false, TypeScript will let you know that you're trying to do something impossible and your code is not going to work as expected. Or maybe it will work as expected, which is not at all, right? TypeScript is a great security layer. Joshua is one of the foremost experts on TypeScript. And in our discussion today, we go super deep on TypeScript. Like, why does it exist? How does it work? But we also talk about the ESLint side of it. ESLint is a tool that analyzes your code as you write it and gives you squiggly underlines, yellow ones for warnings, red ones for errors, and it just helps you enforce like good code quality by warning you of code smells at writing code time, at static time. As a maintainer of the ESLint TypeScript plugin, Joshua has lots of insights to share around what it takes to even build a plugin. Why do you need a plugin if TypeScript already does type checking and more? It is a real deep dive and we learn a ton. Finally, Josh is also the organizer of SquiggleConf, a conference dedicated to the little squiggles that you get when you have type errors or warnings in your code editor. It's happening in Boston. There's tickets for sale. We'll include all relevant links in the show notes, as you know. Now, this is very much separate to my day job. I'm an AI engineer, developer relations engineer at DataStax, and I'd like to offer this to everybody at no cost. And the way we can do this, the way I can make this sustainable is through sponsors. And so let's take a moment to thank them, and then we'll continue with the discussion. The Contagious Code Podcast is sponsored by Code Crafters. Code Crafters is a way of learning that is very close to my way of teaching. We use tools almost every day as engineers, Git, Docker, Redis, things like this. We also write programming code almost every day as programmers. And so what Code Crafters does is they ask you to choose a language that you want to either get better at or that you know, like JavaScript or Python, and then pick a tool like Git or Redis or Docker. And what Code Crafters will have you do is build that tool like from scratch in a language that you either know or want to get better at. By doing this, you get better at the language, but you also get better at the tool. It's really great. And they have a generous free tier, but if you want to start paying, you can get 40% off using the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. The Contagious Code Podcast is also partnered with That Conference. That Conference is a family-first, multidisciplinary tech conference that happens twice a year in the United States, once in Texas and once in Wisconsin. It happens in a water park and is really a summer camp vibe for the whole family. If you'd like to participate or even attend, we give away free tickets to That Conference. Just share this episode on social media, say you'd like to go for free, and you'll enter a raffle to get just that. Hey, thanks for sticking around, and now for my discussion with Joshua Goldberg. Joshua K. Goldberg, what a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, Tejas.
Is K actually like your middle initial?
It is. My middle name is Kevin. I was named after my grandfather, Kopel, who is Ukrainian from Soviet Union, and my parents were worried that Russians would be seen as weak and effeminate, and I'd be bullied for it. So they named me an American name instead.
Interesting. Wow. So much information I didn't ask for, but I'm happy I know.
You're welcome.
Kevin, fun fact, Kevin in Germany, where I'm based, is an insult.
Oh,
they call it like, they're like, dude, you're such a Kevin. And that's probably because, so the lore in Germany is because of Home Alone, the movie Home Alone, where Kevin is apparently a problematic person for some reason.
Kevin McAllister is a badass in that movie. He thwarts two bandits.
Yeah, I tend to think so, but the Germans think otherwise, or at least that's the lore. Anyway, I think we're off to a great start. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to goof around with you, Josh. We've spent so much time at conferences that it's just sort of our natural order. But I do want to obviously offer the listeners more than just comedy. So we will talk about TypeScript, ESLint, formerly the TSLint project, and all of this. But before we do that, could we maybe give a introduction to yourself? Look, you're famous. You need no introduction, but I figure, there's probably someone tuning in from Antarctica who maybe hasn't heard of you. So if you could be so kind as to do an introduction, we can go from there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a full-time independent open source maintainer. I work in the TypeScript ecosystem, also the JavaScript ecosystem. So what that means is instead of working for one specific company, like a Microsoft or DataStax, I'm independent and I work on shared projects that everyone uses. And I get my funding through those projects' sponsorships, their open collectives, and also through my own personal sponsorships on GitHub. It's not the best tech pay, but it's incredibly rewarding and it's really fun. And it lets me contribute directly to the tools that help everyone be better, which makes me very happy.
That's so cool. We have a really great episode with Chad Whitaker, the head of open source at Sentry, who we talk so much about open source sustainability. I can't wait to publish that if it's not already published. Okay, thank you for that great intro. You mentioned a number of things that I think a lot of people want to hear from. And so I don't know if I've mentioned this before we started recording, but a thing we do on the podcast is we draw lines between points of interest. So think of a graph data structure, right? You've got edges and you've got nodes. So there's a bunch of nodes that I think me and the listeners are very interested in, and I'd love to draw edges between them. You mentioned full-time open source maintainer in the TypeScript ecosystem. How and why? I mean, I have to believe there's an origin story here. Did you just use TypeScript a lot and you're like, oh, there's a lot of holes here. I bet I could fix it if I was full-time open source. Or how did that happen?
That's a very, very good simplification of what happened. I think every ecosystem in programming has stuff that's provided by the primary language and tooling around it. Like Microsoft provides, similar to TypeScript, it has .NET with some basic .NET tools and editors around it. But then you get to the whole world of what everyone else does with that stuff. And in every ecosystem, that's very patchy. A lot of that is filled in by independent open source folks, most of whom are just kind of doing it on the side. Maybe they have a few hours a week. Sometimes projects get sustained maintenance. But it's messy, and a lot of the times there's a lot of space for impact if someone can go in and really focus on it. So over my career, first at Microsoft, then at Codecademy, I found myself getting more and more excited about filling in those holes, about doing that open source work that was not particularly difficult, just no one had time for. To the point where in 2021 or so, I realized I was significantly more excited about that than anything else I was doing full time. And because I'd already been kind of making a name for myself with my, TypeScript blog and conference talks and eventually my O'Reilly book that I started working on, I figured I could do this full time and get enough money to make it worth it. And so far, that's been correct.
Interesting. So you found an interest in it. And you said, you know what, this is more meaningful. I'm curious, you mentioned open source work that was not particularly difficult that people just didn't have time for. What are some examples? Is this we need to update the docs, but we don't have the resources? Or is it is it more involved than that?
So much docs work. That's a huge percentage of what I work on now. Like when I joined TypeScript ESLint, which is the tooling that lets you run standard JavaScript tools such as ESLint and Prettier on TypeScript code, there was not a documentation website. It just no one had time for it. It was GitHub Markdown files, which is not a good way to document the standard way to lint TypeScript projects. It's not a good look for TypeScript, and it's not a good user experience. Now we have a full-on documentation website with Docusaurus, and one of the other team members is also a committer to Docusaurus, so it's quite good. And anyone can make a Docusaurus website once they're at a certain level of familiarity. Any SE2, SE1 can do that, but just no one had gotten around to it.
Right. So you've done a lot of work. As I mentioned, you're pretty well known. TypeScript. You literally wrote the book on TypeScript. We'll put links in the show notes to this. But also you maintain ESLint, TypeScript ESLint, and you're a full-time open source maintainer. Can we get a little bit of an overview on that? What came first and how did it proceed? Where did, for example, I have to assume since you worked at Microsoft, there was some TypeScript adjacent stuff, but then TypeScript ESLint. Well, it was probably TSLint by Palantir a long time ago, and this became ESLint, TypeScript, and so on. What was that trajectory like?
Sure. It all started with my very sad nature and my kind of neurotic need to impress everyone around me. I was weird...
I hear some people, sorry to interrupt you, I hear some people start a podcast for that exact reason.
Yeah. How sad. Uh, Misery loves company, Tejas. This is why we get along. We're both very effervescent people, but there's a sad little core that we share that's really glorious.
No, definitely.
Yeah. But my sad little core is that I didn't have a lot of friends when I was a kid. I didn't have what one would call social skills. So I kind of hyperfixated on the things I did find joy out of, which was my parakeet, Emerald, the occasional friend I would have, and retro video games. I played a lot of like Pokemon and Mario and that Age of Empires 2 and stuff over the years. So when I came to college times, I was not the best student, actually, probably not 50% top, but I really wanted to prove myself. I wanted to make sure I'd get a job. So I did the passion project called Full Screen Mario. That was a complete JavaScript redo of the original Super Mario Brothers.
What?
It was, yeah, that's how I got into web dev. That's what made it for me.
You wrote Super Mario in JavaScript in the browser.
Yep.
What? Ooh, like, is this deployed somewhere? Can we put a link to this in the show notes that people can go play it?
I would prefer you didn't put a direct link to it because I've received a few DMCA takedowns from Nintendo, and every time I talk about this too publicly, they send another one. But I would encourage listeners to do their own research. There are plenty of sites online that, like, it was a viral project. It went viral on Reddit first page, and you can find it.
Wait, was it the full game?
Yes, it was the original 32 levels plus a random map generator plus a level editor.
Oh my God. How long did that take you?
About a year.
I'm sorry, like we've met so many times at so many events and I never knew this is where, oh, holy smokes. Dang, man. And this was vanilla JavaScript. This was probably when you were in college, which means there was no React or anything.
Yeah. It was vanilla JavaScript. It was awful. It was objectively probably the worst code I've ever written. It was certainly the biggest amount of code at the time.
Did it use Canvas?
Yeah. Yep. HTML5 Canvas. Because at the time, I was writing it in 2012, 2013. That was new and shiny. We hadn't seen games on the web before. Oh my gosh. This was like Mozilla was releasing demos showing you could do it to prove.
Have you done talks about this at conferences?
Occasionally.
Like, hey, I ported Super Mario to the browser. What?
It's not technically interesting, I think. At the time, it was very technically interesting, but now it's just interesting.
What do you mean
from
it's not technically interesting?
Well, anyway, it's not significantly more complex or different from what a lot of people are doing with Canvas. Like, I think the random map generator actually is probably the most technically interesting part of the project.
Well, I mean, so I built a platform game once when I was like 12 using Game Maker, and you had to just write gravity functions. I feel like that alone is technically interesting. And then object collision. And what happens when you collide with a mushroom, like a bad mushroom versus the growing mushroom? Like that is, of course, that's tech. There's so many people here stuck building like landing pages.
You're right.
Like we don't get to play on the web, man. That's incredible. Now I want your website to be some type of game, and if it's not, I'm going to be disappointed. Anyway, okay, cool. So sorry, I took us down this tangent, but oh my gosh. Okay, so you built Super Mario in JavaScript, and let me guess, and you were like, oh, this is really difficult to refactor, and then you're like, okay, TypeScript.
Yeah. When I posted it on Reddit, a lot of the reaction was, oh, hey, this is really cool. I actually, to this day, still occasionally get people emailing me about little bugs or questions that their kit discovered, which makes me really happy. But a lot of the reaction also was, dude, your code is awful. You should lint it. At the time, TypeScript was still very new, and I didn't want to add that barrier to entry for any potential contributors because it was open source. So I started with ESLint, and that found a lot of stuff. And then I started refactoring it into a game engine because I wanted to make full-screen Pokemon and other full-screen games. And when it became a game engine, that's when I really needed it to be strongly or gradually typed. And I started converting it to TypeScript. This started happening, I think, around 2014 or so, give or take a year, which is when I interned at Microsoft. But I didn't actually use TypeScript when I was at Microsoft until when I started full-time, end of 2015, beginning of 2016. Like a few months after I started full-time.
I'm thrilled to announce that the Contagious Code podcast is now sponsored by Wix Studio. Digital marketers, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less when you manage projects on Wix Studio. You can work in sync with your team on one canvas. You can reuse templates, widgets, and sections across your sites. You can create a client kit for seamless handovers. And you can leverage best-in-class SEO defaults across all your Wix sites. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio to see more. There's a link in the show notes. All right, so that's so interesting that this project has, like, the community's reception to it on Reddit was almost so traumatic that you overcorrected so hard by not just using a linter, but making the lint plugin for the linter, and also, being so actively involved in TypeScript. Oh my goodness, I'm so impressed. And so then after this, you decided to convert it to TypeScript, make the game engine, make it really strong. How do you get from there to, TypeScript isn't complete, I want to contribute to TypeScript. I want to maybe contribute to the linter, and eventually I will maintain the lint plugin.
Yeah, it was a slow process. My involvement in the area started with just seeing that I was on TypeScript and using the standard linter ESLint, and that there were some small things in ESLint that I wanted to improve. I've always been really excited about open source, about being able to make things better for everyone. I think that's incredibly powerful. That's awesome, super rewarding. So when I saw that ESLint, which was at the time the linter for TypeScript, it had like some docs things, like a few typos or missing mentions of community projects. So I started fixing that. And then, oh my God, I actually kind of know what I'm doing here. So then I started sending in bug fixes and feature additions, which is honestly how I now recommend people get into open source. Find some smaller project that you use that you're already familiar with and do really small contributions there to get your feet wet, to get used to it. Don't go like, oh, contribute giant new feature to React or giant new feature to WordPress. You might succeed, but that's a very difficult way to get into this. So yeah, I kept doing that.
It's because of, sorry to interrupt you. So it's because of the two factors. One, it's the project itself is really big, so there's probably a lot of bureaucracy around it. And two, if the feature you're trying to add to the project is really big, then there's going to be so many kinds of opinions that you just don't know. So many conventions that you don't know because the project is big and the feature is big. So what I'm hearing, and I just want to really say this again back to you so that it's cemented in my mind and the listeners' minds, is if you want to get into open source and maybe you're not been so active so far, find a small project and a small feature of that project, which it's probably going to be fewer barriers because there's less big company bureaucracy. And since the feature itself is small, the barrier to actually contributing code with a smaller footprint is the probability of doing that successfully is higher. Is that accurate at all?
Absolutely. You actually referenced this earlier, this idea of lines between points. I think graph theory in that sense is really powerful in this context too, where you want to have as few lines between your current state and the state you're trying to get to next, fewest number of things to learn. So just learning how to do open source contribution is one line, whereas learning this project's architecture and opinions and blah, blah, blah is at least a couple other lines that you don't really want to add there to start.
Right. What's the biggest project you've contributed to in the open source space?
Probably TypeScript.
You've contributed to TypeScript core?
Yes. I added a few features.
What?
And bug
You
fixes.
added features to TypeScript. So you're familiar with how the compiler works and how the language server works.
Yeah. I get more familiar when I contribute, and then I slowly lose that information over time. I don't have a lot of great potential.
This is so cool. This reminds me of Anderist, Mateusz Burzynski, who was also the absolute goat of TypeScript. Okay, you've contributed to small projects, and then you leveled up to TypeScript. Let's talk about TypeScript. You wrote the book on TypeScript with O'Reilly. I'm a fan. I have a copy, I think, somewhere, which you've yet to sign, Josh. In any case, let's talk about TypeScript. Specifically, there's probably listeners listening to this stuck in JavaScript, right? Sort of like you were with your game and before it became an engine. What's the best incremental migration path to TypeScript?
One file at a time, strict true. That's kind of the headliner. Everyone's different. Everyone has a different, set of things they know and are coming from, a different project setup. But almost all the time, the right strategy that I've come to, that others have come to, is don't do everything all at once. Make it so your build system can support both your existing JavaScript files and when you start renaming them to TypeScript files. So do another, love graphs, do another search, figure out what the leaf nodes are. What are the files that don't import from other files? Convert those first so that you don't have TypeScript files importing from JavaScript files. That gets hard to understand for types. So what you end up doing is if it's a front-end app, you end up doing like the design system, the buttons first. If it's a back-end app, you end up converting your like utility functions and or your database stuff first. And then you keep incrementally doing that until eventually you have roughly 100% TypeScript coverage. And then you give yourself a nice pat on the back for doing such a nice job.
Interesting. I think I'm particularly tickled because you mentioned strict true. A lot of people have asked me this question, and of course, I'm no Josh Goldberg, so I went strict false, and then like gradually like raised the strictness. I'm curious why strict true.
Yeah, I'd say strict true, and then maybe no implicit any false if you're not like super duper or if you don't have the time. It's a good question. Strict true is the TypeScript compiler option that says all those opt-in things that you can opt into with the TypeScript type checker that make things more strongly typed but harder to get to. Yeah, turn those on for me. Which, as you can imagine, if you're new to TypeScript, is terrifying, and I would recommend avoiding. If you're not comfortable with it and you don't have a lot of time to learn, strict true might not be for you. But at the very least, strict null checks should always be on. Like that, there's not a single situation I've found where strict null checks should be false. Strict null checks is making it so the language understands that null and undefined are not part of every type. Like you can't pass null to something that says it only allows string. This is an industry called the $1 billion mistake, and it's something they fixed in TypeScript and have fixed in other modern languages. But for legacy reasons, it's still opt-in, which is horrifying.
And can we walk through that one more time to make sure I get it? So strict null checks does it just make sure you handle cases where things that can be null are accounted for, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, in traditional like older programming languages like Java and C++, for example, if you say, let's say something is type string, you can pass that language's equivalent of null there. That's allowed. That's why in interviews in Java, people have to do for every function parameter, if the parameter is null, throw new not null exception or whatever. Which is horrifying. Why would you be allowed to do that?
Right. So that's non-strict null checks. That's like lax null checks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Strict null checks, technically speaking, is, well, A, better, but B, it makes it so null and undefined are just normal parts of the type system. That if you have a union type, say this or that, that's the only way to say that something can be null if it could also be a string.
Interesting. But if you have a type, say like type, I don't know, name is equivalent to a string, a nominal type, the type system will it ever, like even with strict null checks, true or false, will it ever warn you that it could potentially be null? Probably not, right? Because you're just assigning the type there in the code.
Yeah, if you say something's going to be a string, TypeScript will believe you. And then TypeScript trusts that you're not going to somehow finagle a null or a number into there against its will.
Right, so the developer is responsible for unioning the null. And then when the developer does that, then TypeScript will have you handle the cases where it can be null.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, great. I get free lessons and things here. That's so cool. So full disclosure, I leave this on and I just don't ask questions. And then sometimes TypeScript says, hey, this could be null. And then I just add a bang. I'm joking. I handle the case. Yeah, triggering Josh. No, it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm building a POC, of course, I add a bang. And a bang, for those listening, is just a big exclamation point, and it tells TypeScript, listen, stop being so pedantic. What's the most advanced thing that you know in TypeScript that maybe a lot of people don't?
The most advanced?
Yeah, like some people, they're scared of like the infer keyword. Because and what I've heard around this is infer. Why is there a keyword for this? Does TypeScript not infer types automatically? I mean, I get autocomplete, right? Isn't that inference? So there's a lot of mystique with listeners around the infer keyword. So that's just an example. I mean, you don't have to explain it, but what is something that you would consider advanced and mysterious enough to people? And you since you're so active in TypeScript, you wrote the book, you know.
You keep saying the book.
And you can explain.
Like there aren't other TypeScript books. That Matt Pocock isn't about
to eat my lunch.
I will
also say that Matt Pocock I don't know if he dropped his book yet, but indeed he's going to drop his book. But there's also Basarat. So before I even knew who you were, there's a dude named, I forget his full name, but Basarat used to work at Atlassian, lives in Australia, and wrote what I consider, to me, the TypeScript book, because that's where I learned TypeScript from.
Yeah.
I mean, the docs, as you mentioned, had a story, and so he wrote this beautiful Git book. And for me, this is the definitive guide. Anyway, yeah, I apologize. You wrote one of the books.
Yeah.
In any case, let's get back to the advanced thingy.
I also learned from the Basarat Git book. Shout out Basarat. Yeah, so top of head, it's hard to go most advanced, but yeah, I'll say like shenanigans with type parameters are a big one that most people don't know them and don't have a need to know them. But once in a while, like if you're getting deeper into TypeScript, they're really useful. Const type parameters are really cool too. And there are a lot of lines leading to understanding const type parameters.
By type parameters, do you mean generics?
Yes.
Or okay.
Have you seen Matt Pocock's There is no such thing as a generic talk?
Oh, I have not, but I feel like I should, and we should put links to that in the show notes. No, tell me about it.
Yeah, it's a great talk and article. One of my favorite things about TypeScript is that we have a lot of really great people in the community who I get the pleasure of telling people to link to. So the word generic is an adjective, not a noun. You have generic functions, generic interfaces. And you could use generics, plural, to refer to things that may be generic. But technically speaking, a type parameter is what people often call a generic. A type parameter is what you declare on a function, similar to how you can declare runtime parameters, which is different from an argument. An argument is something you give the thing, like you give a runtime argument or you give a runtime type argument. Blah. So generics is kind of the umbrella term or the adjective, and we try not to use it because it's ambiguous.
That's so cool, man! I'm learning so much. You're like a treasure chest of TypeScript information. Okay, so shenanigans with type parameters. I agree. I do find them complex, and you know why I find them complex, Josh, is because I don't know. I think this comes from like old school computer science or Java or something, but people usually give these parameters like a single character name. And I just don't know why. Like, here's my function that takes an input, and its parameter is t, and I'm like, why t? Why
what?
u? What?
Yeah.
Like, there, yeah. What is t? Why is that? Can we condemn that publicly? Do you have a take on this?
I do. I condemn that in all but the most straightforward cases. It's like I and for loops, like IJK for a triple for loop. That's okay. There are very few cases otherwise where it's okay, because I see these huge like Lodash style utility libraries with like 4 generic type parameters. I almost said generics on a function, and it's like T, U, V, and X. What the hell does that mean? Yeah, no. Unless it's really straightforward what the T is. If it's like a generic utility, like, I don't know, reverse an array that takes in a T, and then it's like array of T array. Like that's, unless it's something really straightforward, you should name your type parameters something clear.
Yeah, or if it's something that you sort of know what it's going to be, like for example a reducer, like you know what an action, like it can take a generic action, then you don't need to call your generic type parameter an action because you just call it a, right?
But I don't know, as someone who's not commonly using things like Redux or like that type of Reduxian setup, I find it very hard to go to a code base where they have strong conventions and then refer to them by single letter. It's not as bad, you're right, but if possible, I personally prefer to be a little more explicit and call it like a action.
Yeah, because there's
D data.
Right. Because there's no cost. Like if this was JavaScript, you could make a case for using a single character, maybe, because then you save on bundle size. In fact, that's what minifiers do. But this is all compiled away. So like, why are we being stingy with the bytes?
Yeah, I think people's pushback often is that it becomes harder to read when you have a lot of names. And there is, I think, a reasonable trade-off there. I just don't consider that trade-off to be worthwhile most times.
Good. What are some recent additions coming to TypeScript that people maybe haven't heard of?
Ooh. It's not as new now, but Satisfies is really nice. It's a great source of puns around the word satisfying, but B, it's a way that you can declare some data, make sure the data adheres to or satisfies some type, but then still allow TypeScript to infer a more specific type from it, which was not easy to do before. I like that.
How is this different from as const?
As const makes it completely read-only and immutable, which if you didn't want, if you wanted it to be mutable, well, sucks.
Right. So you can define like a type, or say an object, a person, like name, string, age, number. And then if you have a JavaScript object, you could enforce, if I understand correctly, that this object, or no, satisfies doesn't intersect with runtime, does it? It's more like a type can satisfy another type.
Yeah.
But a runtime literal can't satisfy a type.
Literals can satisfy literal types. Let's say that you wanted to declare a value that's like a person with a name, string, and an age, int or undefined, whatever. And then you want to make sure that some variable satisfies that type. But also, you know that that variable's age is a number. So if you want to refer to like, my person dot age 2 lines down, you want to be able to refer to it as a number. You don't want to have to like use a bang or like as number or something. You want TypeScript to know that the age is a number. So if you did my person, colon space person to like a type annotation, then TypeScript would think, okay, age could be undefined, so that get in their way that way. If you say as const, now it's read only. If you say as person, well, then it's again asserted to the person. There's like no, other than the word satisfies, there's no actual way to make sure it is this shape, but also allow a more specific type inference on it.
Interesting. That's so detailed and nuanced. That's so cool. I wonder what was the pain that led to that. Probably exactly what you mentioned. There's just no way to apply a broad enough type to something with further fine tuning allowed. Yeah. Awesome. Wow. Okay. What was the process like writing this book and then shipping it, and what has the reception been like?
Oh man, I would love to know, as a fellow O'Reilly author, how we are similar or different in this regard. I started writing the book because O'Reilly reached out to me. I had already made somewhat of a name for myself working in open source, giving talks at the TypeScript conferences about wacky shenanigans in the type system, and just kind of generally being around on the internet. They wanted a first round or like introduction to TypeScript book, something for people who didn't know anything else. And I think that that's a very good way to teach TypeScript. I would want you to know JavaScript first because TypeScript builds on JavaScript, but I don't want you to need to know like C# or any other type language. So we kind of figured out a skeleton, a very rough outline based on that. Broke that down into chapters. We did the graph thing where you figure out what requires what, lines pointing at each other. And then over the next year, I went through one chapter at a time, writing the book. I don't know what else.
And then you published it?
Yeah.
And then you published it. And then what did people, I mean, it was obviously it's very popular. I've seen a number of developers have it and sing its praises. Oh. Did you feel a sense of accomplishment? Do you feel like, oh my God, I'm an author now? Do you wear the credential? Does it open doors for you?
Oh yeah, that credential opens doors. It really does. It was a lot easier to get gigs speaking or private consulting or doing workshops. I will say I am very proud of the book. I'm very happy to have done it. I'm a perfectionist, and although the reception has been like high level positive, there are more typos in the book than I'm really happy with. I had a lot of stuff going on, to put it politely, in that time of the year and my life, and we had a kind of rushed last month, and man, it really bugs me. It really bugs me. I worked at Codecademy, which was tailored to beginning to code, like really even new to computers people. So I saw firsthand how incredibly destructive it is to have even one typo or like one mistake in a code block for someone who's not even sure they can use a computer. And then my book comes out and they're like a huge chapter. That really gets to me, man. I really want to do a second edition just to fix those stupid typos.
Yeah, you should. I would support that. I actually also keep my book here, like next to me, because you know how like when actors win an award, an Emmy, they just like that's their entire life. Yeah, you got your book also. Yeah, it's I'm joking, of course. I just seem to have it because I have it here to give it away to someone. In any case, yeah, I can tell you if we're similar or not. For me, it was exactly the same. So I did a talk about. It was actually, I think, my most viewed talk ever. It was I was going to a meetup in February 2020, like just before the lockdowns, just before things went nuts, and it was really bad weather in Berlin, and the meetup organizer was panicking because the speakers didn't come. There was no content, and I was there, so he was like, "Oh my God, Tejas, you talk. Can you like just make up something?" And I was like, "Yeah, why not?" And so I did this talk where I said, "Do any of you really know how React works?" And people were like, "Yeah, I use it." I was like, "No, how it works?" And so I wrote a React app, but then I didn't import React. And so, you get the runtime error, like cannot read create element of undefined. And I said, look, we're not going to install React. We'll just like write it. We'll create an object, have create element on it. That's a function. Okay, what's its signature? And like we slowly like polyfilled some, bare bones version of React. And people went like, whoa, that's so cool. Anyway, so that talk got a lot of views. And I suspect this is where O'Reilly sort of saw it. And they reached out to me and they said, hey, can you like write the book? And I was like, yeah, why not? Kind of like you, actually exactly like you. And so I did that. I traveled a lot to the US and back, 16-hour flights, and I literally just wrote the book on the plane with no internet.
Beautiful.
The whole thing was written in Markdown, and they published it. And then, I think also after the fact was similar for me. It did open a lot of doors and so on. I haven't really looked at the money very much because I didn't do it for that reason. I have a job. And so whatever, I guess that's just bonus.
I'll take your money.
I'm glad to know that we're similar.
That's fine.
I'll send
Great.
it to you.
Yeah.
GitHub sponsors. Yeah, for real. Awesome. So look, did you start working on ESLint TypeScript or TypeScript ESLint, excuse me, when it was still TSLint, or did you come after?
I came after. There was a period of time where we actually had two not deprecated projects for linting TypeScript. TSLint was a standalone dedicated linter for TypeScript made by folks working at Palantir. Palantir is a company that actually does quite amazing software, but also has a bit of a reputation for working too closely with Trump and Trump-esque people in government. I'm not saying that to make this a political podcast, just to explain why it was that a lot of people didn't contribute to TSLint or feel comfortable using it, given that this was around the 2015 to 2017 era in American politics. So that was one disadvantage for TSLint. The other was that at the same time, there was already a standard JavaScript linter called ESLint, which was significantly more popular. Everyone wrote their plugins for ESLint first. So every time we wanted to get a plugin for TSLint, we'd have to port it from ESLint. There was no compat story. So then someone, James Henry and co, wrote what is now called TypeScript ESLint, which is a TypeScript tooling portion for ESLint. Eventually, actually a few months after I joined as a maintainer of TSLint to try to bring it to the community, TSLint was announced as being deprecated, and we'd all moved to TypeScript ESLint, which I eventually joined like a year or two later myself.
Awesome. When it comes to TypeScript, which you've contributed to, or TypeScript ESLint, in both cases, you've got to analyze code, right? With TypeScript, you take the TypeScript file and you go, okay, do the types match and, what can be null and so on. Like it literally just looks at the source code and gives you like red squigglies. We'll talk about squiggleconf. Or TypeScript ESLint, even ESLint does the same thing. Looks at a bunch of code and says, hey, watch out, this can be null or undefined. In both cases, you need to statically analyze code. Since you've maintained the plugin, since you've contributed, to TypeScript, I wonder if you can walk the listeners through how that happens.
Sure. It sounds less approachable than it is. What we're going to talk about is the concept of an AST, abstract syntax tree. When I first heard AST, I figuratively pooed myself and ran away. It sounded to me like some advanced crap that I would never want to learn. Nowadays, I feel much more confident telling people, no, it's fine. An AST is just a description of what's in your file. Most ASTs can be viewed as just JSON or plain old JSON objects. You have a string that is your source text, fs.read file, parentheses, myfile.ts. And that AST description contains an array of statements or other things. And each of those, let's say it's a class that has a .name property and a members property, and that members is an array of things, and so on and so forth. It's just all this stuff in your file. We represent your file as an AST, as this JavaScript object or JSON object, so that tooling such as ESLint or TypeScript can then look at that and make deductions. Like if we see that there's a variable declared at some point in the file, but then that name, that identifier, is never used anywhere else in the file, we can give you a little squiggly in the variable saying, hey, unused variable, did you mean to use this somewhere? And that's the core underlying concept behind basically all static analysis, which is tooling that builds an AST and looks at your code, which includes formatters, linters, and type checkers.
So it sounds like you read a big string that's just a string. There's nothing there. And from this string, you deduce an AST, which is just a big JSON object that says on line 1, between character space 1 and 4 or 1 and 5, we have the word const. Const means a constant declaration, and I know I had to count as well. And after the word const, then there's a space, and then between the subsequent character sets is the identifier of the constant. And so what I hear you saying is you have this big JSON object that represents literally like each token, as it were, as a type of thing. So const is a keyword, a reserved keyword. The name of the constant is an identifier. The equal sign is an assignment operator, and whatever you assign the const to is either a string literal or an object declaration. So each thing in an AST has an object that represents it. Is that accurate?
Yes, very much so.
How does one get from string to this object?
That's the part I'm least familiar with. It's called parsing. And in fact, most of us as web developers are familiar with this at the very high level because we've used JSON.parse. And it's actually pretty similar on the inside to JSON parsing. There's the concept of you iterate through the file, and then as you come across stuff, you mark what you're currently seeing and build up a kind of context as you go along. Like if you see function, some identifier, left parentheses, okay, I'm about to start parsing function parameters. Not arguments, parameters. And then when you see the right parentheses, you say, okay, I'm done parsing the function parameters. Now I'm going to parse whatever, the return type or the right squiggly, the body. Yeah. And there's just a whole list of rules for how to do this. What do you do inside a class body, a function declaration, the root of a program, whatever. Eventually, once the file is complete, you will pop the stack of all the contexts you're in, and voila, you have generated the file. It actually feels magical when you write your first parser. It's like actually really satisfying to observe.
So these rules, you said there's like many, many rules that dictate, how a function declaration is parsed, for example. These rules are rooted in the language specification, if I'm connecting dots here. So yeah. JavaScript is ultimately just a big text document. A language specification. Const means this. The equal sign means that. Plus plus means this. That's built and maintained by Technical Committee 39, TC39, at ECMA, the European Computer Manufacturers Association. And that's the rule set. And so if you want to build a JavaScript parser, go read the document, read a text file, and make sure it adheres to that. Is that close? Like, is that if somebody was listening and they want to go make a JavaScript parser, is that sound advice?
That is sound advice, yes. I would question why they want to build a parser when there's so many good parsers out there, but if they're just doing it to learn, fantastic project.
Yeah, I wonder if there's one in Rust. I bet if not, somebody's going to do it and be like, look how much faster it is. Which somebody tweeted, I saw a tweet from someone, I think it was Zach Jackson from Module Federation, who said he bets that within this year, nice job. He bets that within this year we will see a Rust version of React. And I read this and I was just going like, okay, but like why? I mean, I get that it's faster, but at this point, if you want faster React, use Solid or similar. Anyway, that's probably a discussion for another time. Fantastic. So how does TSLint then work? Does it actually do that? Just read a text file, call a function. Maybe it's behind a black box abstraction. File.parse. You get an AST. You traverse the AST. You look for weird patterns. For example, like you said, unused variable. And then you report that to the user. How does one report that to the user in VS Code? I have to assume that VS Code itself, the plugin for VS Code, has some type of listener where you can pass a message saying, hey, this... Like, the question I'm asking in a broad way is, how do you get from an AST to the squiggly?
Sure. There are a few steps there. I'll try to be good at saying each step one at a time. The first step is we just covered text to AST. The next step is given an AST, determining where you would want the squigglies. The where you would want squigglies part is defined in your rules, your lint rules. And this has been the case ever since ESLint came around over a decade ago with a nice pluggable architecture where you could disable, enable, and then create custom rules. So each rule in lint land is one description of a behavior we'd like to enforce, along with the logic to do that. For example, I don't know, let's say you wanted to make a rule that said, don't use var, use let. In actuality, that's a little complex because var has weird scoping shenanigans. But just to keep it real simple, let's just say whenever it sees a variable declaration with the var, it would want to report a use let and then provide an autofixer saying replace those 3 characters var to lat. The way that ESLint would do it is each rule is given a source file. So the rule would then recursively traverse through the source file. They're little nice helpers where you could basically say for each node in the source file, if it matches this characteristic, call some context API to report my complaint. So if you see a variable declaration and its kind is var instead of let or const or using, then you call the report function with the variable and a fixer that returns let. ESLint is a little nicer. Sorry, I'm going ahead, please.
No. I just wanted to ask you, this context function to report, that comes then from the runner of the plugin, aka ESLint, right?
Yeah. Linters will give.
So again, just to clarify, sorry to interrupt. So ESLint will give you a function that is basically like report, and you call report. You pass in the arguments, not parameters, and then it does it for you. ESLint will do this for you. That's
correct?
Correct.
I have a bad habit of droning on in my explanations. I'm glad you're interrupting me. It's better.
No, it's perfect. No, it's perfect. I want you to drone on, and a lot of the listeners actually like hate the fact that I interrupt people. So they're like, "Oh my gosh, it's your podcast, and you have a guest, but you talk way more than the guest." So I apologize. Anyway,
out of all the very good reasons to hate you, Tejas, that one hasn't come up for me yet. All right, so that was how ESLint did things. Now, ESLint actually has a slightly nicer way. ESLint, you can do that. It does give the full AST to rules, but it also has this really nice convenience thing where from your rule, you can provide an object where the keys are queries for the AST. It's called ESQuery, and it's basically CSS selectors for the AST. Instead of doing like div space p, you can do like variable declaration space init type equals string literal or whatever. Like you can do CSS queries for your AST and then just jump straight to the offending node within the value.
Is that that has to be some type of formal specification for AST traversal?
I don't know how formal it is, but it is a standard open source library called ESQuery that's under the ESTools GitHub org called ECMAScript tooling.
This is cool, man. This is why I love interviewing expert guests or having discussions. Actually, try to not interview. I try to have discussions. It's bidirectional. But anyway, I love this because I learned that. That's so cool. I've written, fun fact, maybe not a lot of people know this, the basis or the origin of my friendship with Kent C. Dodds, former guest on the podcast, is that he had a library called Glamorous that he deprecated and said, everybody go use Emotion. And I was working at a company at the time that was using Glamorous, and this was quite expensive to migrate. And so that's when I decided to get into ASTs and write a code mod to change Glamorous code to Emotion code. And I built this, and it was open source, and I showed it to Kent, and he was like, this is so great. Anyway, all that to say, I think that, what we're talking about here will enable people to do that. I built that with like a really poor visitor pattern where we literally traverse through each node and go like, okay, is this a Glamorous thing converted to an Emotion thing? But wow, if I had selectors like this, that would be so cool. What's it called?
ESQuery. All this stuff, by the way, is documented really nicely. The ESLint.org docs have like a full how to build custom rules. And then in the TypeScript ESLint docs, we also have a description of how to build custom rules that links to the ESLint developer guide and some other nice utilities. So I would highly encourage anyone doing code mods to use ESLint. It's fantastic. It's got built-in like testing utilities, and as you said, you can use basically the same AST like the visitor pattern to write your rules. It's really fun.
Why does ESLint have first-class support for TypeScript? Why do we still need a plugin for TypeScript? Is it just because it's called ESLint and they want to stay true to the name? It's actually ECMAScript.
Yeah, I'm very conflicted on this. It is really inconvenient that you have to use TypeScript ESLint to bring in types syntax and then even types support. But TypeScript is just another community project from the perspective of TC39. It's not, quote unquote, just another. It's like the most popular community project that's ever existed for JavaScript, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, we will eventually maybe have a competitor to TypeScript, and it's going to be real inconvenient when TypeScript has this obscene leg up in the market where every tool supports it out of the box, and then that competitor is at a disadvantage. That being said,
So it's just...
Sorry, please.
So go ahead. No.
There are two parts of TypeScript that people need to support. There's the syntax, and then some people additionally also need to support the concept of a type system. It's pretty straightforward to support TypeScript syntax these days. There are a lot of standard tools like SWC that can just parse TypeScript syntax. It's a superset of JavaScript. But then the concept of types is still under development. We still haven't really figured out how to do that properly in, say, the lint space. So if ESLint were to build in TypeScript syntax support, people would then also want TypeScript type support. But that question is unanswered. How true to the TypeScript types do we want to bake into ESLint? Like, there's no ES type equivalent. So that I think for me is a big blocker.
But why should there be type support? Can you not use TypeScript for types and ESLint for lint? I mean, that's just a natural separation, right? Like there's also the discussion around like ESLint and Prettier, because they also have this like weird Venn diagram overlap. So like if ESLint natively supported TypeScript, why not just support TypeScript for things outside of type inference?
That's a great question. The way the tools are structured is quite different. ESLint is currently architected to run on one rule or one file, at a time. It looks at each file independently and assumes that that file is its own cache key. You don't care about other files. Whereas TypeScript looks at all files at once. So at the beginning of your project, you need to tell TypeScript where everything is. ESLint can just run completely on files. So you get into these annoying architectural disagreements where like ESLint's caching is just completely broken when you introduce TypeScript types. And there are all sorts of bugs in like editor extensions where you have file A importing from file B, you save file B, file A's lints are now out of date. Also, lint rule, this is all because lint rules in TypeScript ESLint now have the ability to use type information. It's called type checked or type aware or typed linting. It's incredibly powerful. We can do things like detect floating promises, which are a huge source of bugs. We can let you use the type checker to write custom rules, but now we're really expanding past the point where ESLint is comfortable with us.
Interesting. Well, what are floating promises?
Let's say you have an async function and you call the function. Most of the time when you call an async function, you're trying to like, const value equals await call my function or something. But if you forget the await, if you just call the function, well, that's called and you don't store that promise somewhere, that's called a floating promise because it's likely a sign that you forgot to factor it into your control flow. The really common example would be like fs.write file and then 3 lines later fs.read file. If you forgot to await the writes, now you're doing both at the same time.
Oh, wait.
This is one of the most popular rules, and it's actually a big reason why a lot of companies stick with TypeScript ESLint, even though they're faster alternatives. But it's kind of annoying to configure because now you have to have TypeScript running as a dependency of your ESLint rules.
Why? I mean, why do you need TypeScript for this? Can you not just recognize through analyzing the AST that the await keyword is missing?
You can, but how do you know that the thing is an async function? You need a type system. What if you imported that function from an NPM package?
So you need to know that it returns a promise. Yeah. Specifically, and the return type is a type. Okay,
and what if that NPM package uses really fancy, ridiculous TypeScript types? Now you need full TypeScript support to run your lint rules.
Right, because otherwise it'll be a promise of any if it can't be inferred or if there was no type system. And then, wow, okay, so there's no way around this other than with the whatever you call it, the type support.
Linting. It's a huge value prop, a huge thing in our favor, TypeScript ESLint. There's no other linter right now that's mainstream and does this, which I think is bad. And I think that the ecosystem needs more competition here. And I know other linters are actively looking into it, like Dino and Biome and OXC, but it's a hard problem to solve when you're written in Rust rather than JavaScript, TypeScript.
You mentioned earlier, TC39 doesn't want to add native TypeScript support to ESLint. I didn't even know they were involved.
I'm sorry,
ESLint, to be fair, but you mentioned
that's the conceptual level. There's no type system in JavaScript, and then as a result, ESLint does things. TC39 is not involved with ESLint directly, so I didn't mean to.
Right. So So ESLint just follows whatever TC39 says, it sounds like. And since they don't say anything about TypeScript, just no, because it's ESLint. Do you really think that TypeScript's not too big to fail, and that there's like viable cause for a competitor that might supersede TypeScript?
I'm being very careful here to try to mark a delineation between what I perceive the ESLint project's opinions as and my opinions. Everything I've said so far is the...
Well, you could just disclaim it.
Disclaimer.
You could just preface it with,
If it were up to me, if I, as someone who's only recently joined the ESLint project, I only joined 6-7 months ago, if I were completely in charge, I would rewrite ESLint to... See, the problem is you need to rewrite ESLint to support this stuff. The current architecture is 10 years old. So I would rewrite ESLint to provide a few things. I would have TypeScript as the default parser for TypeScript files out of the box. It would be the default provider of types. There'd be a lot more API hooks for plugins like TypeScript ESLint so that we could do performance optimizations. Fun fact, parsers don't actually know when ESLint starts or stops. ESLint doesn't give us that information, which means we have a lot of performance things we have to do magic workarounds around. And that project is actually going on. They are rewriting ESLint for all this stuff, but it's going to take a while. So,
So it's coming, it sounds like.
If you go on GitHub, github.com/ESLint/rewrite, there is a mono repo that Nicholas Zakis has started to really go on. And you can actually see there are quite a few people who've committed to the repo, especially from ESLint's TSC.
That's cool. Yeah. That's so great. So we might see it. Okay. But still, I want to press you a little bit. Is TypeScript too big to fail?
Define fail.
I mean, I remember there was a time, fail isn't like not be adopted anymore because there's something quote unquote better. I mean, like, or if I want to be really crude about it, if I define fail, I would just say end up like flow.
Got it. Yeah, it's too big to fail in that way. If a new competitor comes out to TypeScript that's significantly better, I think I could see the ecosystem moving to that the way that we went from like CoffeeScript to TypeScript. However, TypeScript is so ingrained that we're never going to get rid of it. It's now become one of those many languages that just you can't kill. It's there. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I feel so as well. Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've covered TypeScript. We've covered TESLint and TypeScript ESLint and the sort of the bridge between them. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about performance. Like why? So I don't use ESLint at all. Like at all. In fact, if you write like npm create next app and you want to create a new Next.js app, it asks you, do you want to use ESLint? And the default is no. And a big reason for this is performance. Like I work on an M1 MacBook Pro, and for work I have an M3 MacBook Pro. And even with this, with VS Code, my laptop starts levitating because of the fans. Usually when ESLint is on some larger project. So this may be a little bit of hyperbole, but I would be surprised if I was the only one asking this. Why is it so slow? Is it a combination of VS Code being an Electron app running this and the ESLint language server? It's a complete black box to those of us outside of the project. ESLint is not actually that slow. I would assume it's other tools causing this. Are you sure that it's ESLint that's giving you levitation?
Yeah, because when I disable the plugin, everything just responds pretty rapidly. So it could also be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it could also just be the amount of plugins, right? There's usually not just TypeScript ESLint. There's accessibility plugins. There's code style plugins that work in tandem with Prettier. There's just a whole slew of plugins. So maybe it's that. Could it be that? I assume, since you mentioned how the caching works, it's one file at a time. N plugins need to run on this file, n being just an arbitrary number. Could that be why?
It could be the number of VS Code extensions, but if you're saying that it's specifically you turn off or on just the ESLint one, I would say two things. One, by itself, ESLint is fine for performance. It's almost always misconfiguration, from what I've seen, that results in performance issues. However, actually three things. That's one. Two, it's too easy to misconfigure. This shouldn't be the case. The tool is not doing enough to stop us from oopsieing. And 3, there are a lot of performance issues when you start introducing cross-file linting, like with typed linting or with the import plugin that analyzes your imports. So even if you've completely configured it correctly, it might still be the case that you've just got a huge project and you're using expensive linting and the structure has not been built up to support that. So which of those areas do you think is you?
I think it's a skill issue, as you said, misconfiguration. I hear misconfiguration, I just think skill issue. To be fair, I seldom am the one who sets up the plugin. I more just like inherit a code base, clone it, npm install, open, and like when I'm 5 files in, like things start to, and the things that start to go wrong is usually the squigglies are stale. So and so I confirm this by I'll just reload VS Code and everything catches up. I also experience this with TypeScript from time to time, but it's very seldom. It happens more common in ESLint that some lint rule is playing up. I can't for the life of me figure out why. I think I went on Twitter once and posted a screenshot of this, and the caption was "Go home, ESLint, you're drunk." And then I reloaded it, and it got better. So I do think it's misconfiguration. I think it's also extension or plugin overload, not VS Code extension, but ESLint extension, because we had a lot of plugins for a lot of different things, including like CSS and JS plugins and like a whole slew of them. So to extend the question, not just to be all complainy about it, if there's listeners with slow ESLint configurations, what are some configuration hacks to help ESLint be faster or to like improve, because it's so easy to misconfigure? What are some ideal configuration patterns?
Remove anything to do with prettier. There are quite a few steps. This is by far and away the most commonly impactful one. A lot of people use ESLint plugin prettier. An ESLint plugin prettier's job. Stop.
I use that.
Stop doing that, Tejas. Please. That's probably why your ESLint is slow. Not definitely, but probably. ESLint plugin prettier runs prettier within an ESLint rule. So for each AST or each file, it passes I think probably just either the AST or the text of the file to prettier, runs prettier, gets the result back for every file. On its own, that's not that bad. But if you have other expensive ESLint rules, every time you hit save, then prettier runs, all those rules run. Then it gets fixed for your formatting things. Then everything runs again. If you have multiple rules with fixers, you're doing everything over and over and over again. It becomes a whole cycle, because when you auto fix, it runs up to 10 or 11 times to keep exhausting the rules. It keeps rerunning them. So there's no actual. I do not approve as a human of running prettier inside ESLint. I strongly recommend using that as a separate tool, so that those separate tools can optimize each thing for what run cycle it's best for.
So as part of your build pipeline, you run ESLint -- fix, get all the fixes, get everything sorted, and then run prettier on it as sort of the final boss.
In builds, I wouldn't run with -- fix. If you mean just like in like running locally, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, good. So on CI you wouldn't do fix because that will just change your code, and then you can't commit it anyway. Yeah, and then it's probably going to be green because it's fixed, but the code is not fixed. Yeah, I see that. Yeah. Awesome. Just one more thing, just to tie back to, we talked about ASTs and compilers and so on. I think it's just worth mentioning for the listeners that -- fix works exactly as you'd expect. So you get this big JavaScript object, and you just like change, var to let. And then you rewrite the file, right? You just call fs write. So it's fs read file, parse into AST, read AST, find problem, replace that node in the object, and then you convert it to a stringify it, and then write it to the file. I assume that's how it works, but I just wanted to get that clear for the listeners also.
I do want to note on the performance stuff.
Good.
Most of the time when people have slow performance, it's because they're using cross-file linting. The import plugin has some known rules that are slow when used with TypeScript stuff, and we actually have a FAQ on the TypeScript ESLint site for performance with type linting, suggesting which rules are still useful and which you should really turn off. But if your TypeScript is slow, like if it takes a second to compute type information for a file and you're using typed linting, your typed linting is going to take probably at least a second. So we see a lot of people who come to us blaming ESLint because that's what they experience as slowness. But the root cause was they had some ridiculous, 3,000 level ternary nested conditional type in TypeScript that was slowing everything.
Can typed linting be turned on and off via configuration param? in the
Yeah,
TypeScript
the way
ESLint
it works
plugin?
is individual rules are we'll have like a little meta documentation thing saying whether they're typed, and we actually provide for each of our recommended configs a version with and a version without type linting. So like recommended and then also recommended type checked. So you can completely avoid type linting and all the wonderful benefits of it if you're not ready for that performance discussion.
Awesome. Have you used TypeScript in the enterprise? Like, have you consulted for TypeScript in like very large, like, 2 million people? Well, maybe not 2 million, but very large enterprise settings. And is that somehow different from the like on the ground developers that you talk to?
Often super different. I have done the occasional consulting call or a little gig. For the most part, the bigger the company, the bigger the code base. That's not always true, but often is. So you end up getting more performance scenarios being the root cause rather than teach us how to TypeScript. Like bigger companies have more resources and then also like logically bigger challenges. But yeah, I think that TypeScript's been doing a lot of work the last few years for the enterprise use case, and they just released isolated declarations, which is going to be really helpful for really big code bases. That's a way to like, they have an existing system called project references, which lets you split up your TypeScript build steps into projects, and isolated declarations is a really, really nice way to make that a lot faster.
There was a config flag in TypeScript's compiler configuration that I keep getting asked to turn on, but I don't know what it is. I think it's like isolated modules or like down level something. Do you know what I'm talking about? Or should I look this up?
Because there are two that sound like what you're describing. Isolated modules is
yeah. No, go ahead. It was like. I need to look. There was like down level iteration or something like that. Anyway,
sure.
Let's start with isolated modules.
The way TypeScript traditionally worked was it would have type information available when it transpiled, like when it took your TypeScript file and turned it into JavaScript. Not all tools have that available. If you use something like Babel or SWC or ESBuild, they're not running the type checkers, so they don't have access to type information. In theory, that type information should not be necessary to turn your TypeScript syntax to JavaScript. In theory, it should just be remove all the types, and then what you have left is JavaScript. But there are cases where it's ambiguous. Like if you import and then just export something from another module, there's no way of knowing whether this is a type or a value. So then tools like Babel would have these weird issues where you'd be exporting something, and then at runtime it would say, hey, this doesn't exist. What are you doing? So isolated isolated modules is a compiler flag in TypeScript to say, don't let me do any of this ambiguous stuff. Give me a complaint if it's not clear, like in the actual syntax, whether this is a type or not.
Right. Awesome. And then what is it was down level iteration. I believe that's the one. And it's just a true I don't know what I know what iteration is. But I've always struggled with this, like down level.
So JavaScript, as produced by our wonderful saviors at TC39, has a new version roughly every year, ES 2017, ES 2018, and so on. One of the features that got added years and years ago now was iteration primitives, things like for of loops, which down level to it's actually not as simple as just there's a loop iterated. There's like this thing called symbol.iterator, and like you have like this syntax that is equivalent to a for of loop. There's the nice way of transpiling, of down leveling from modern syntax to old, and then there's the like kind of more standards compliant helper function that you can do to be more specific. Like you can do for I equals 0, or you can actually call to the symbol iterator, like do the built-in things. Most of the time when someone writes a for a loop, they just want the for I equals. They want the simple thing. But to be very technically spec compliant, you have to use the symbol iterator. So down level iteration is a compiler option saying that if TypeScript is the one transpiling your code, then which one of those two, the nice one or the technically correct one, it should use. This isn't relevant for most people, though, because most people don't even use TypeScript to transpile these days. Most people just use like ESBuild or something.
Yeah. What most people will do is they'll use TypeScript to type check, and then they use, like you said, ESBuild or something. Yeah, and then the other flag that I really had a hard time with was skip lib check. And here's this one. The TypeScript compiler literally just gave me a red squiggly, and then in the error it said turn on skip lib check. And then it went away. And I don't know what happened, but cool, I guess. I'm sure I'm not the only developer
this
who's
comes up a
experienced
lot.
this.
It's a great flag. If your node modules have a type error, would you want TypeScript to tell you about it?
Probably not.
Wouldn't you want to know about that error, Tejas?
No, because I'm compiling them away anyway. Like, I want to know about are you being sarcastic? Like, okay, I want to know about my code's type errors, not... Yeah, like if I import something from React and they have like a poor type definition, I don't care. That's their problem. As long as it works at runtime, because it's a black box abstraction, right?
I'm of a similar opinion. There are people who are running delicate, sensitive projects where they want to make sure the node modules don't come into conflict with each other. Like, React version 18 with a React version 17.9 tailored plugin, they might not be compatible. You might get a type error. But yeah, for the most part, most projects these days turn on skip libcheck to skip type checking of library or node modules files.
That's what that is. Wow. That's such an assumption that every node module is a library. Like, it could have been named skip node module type check, skip dependency type check,
but
skip something.
Let's talk about this. I love this. This is one of the most fun and ridiculous and like bike shedding-y parts of working on these tools. The broader the audience usage, the more ridiculously hard it is to name things. Your libs might not be in node modules. Node modules as a term is a subset of the lib term, which is itself a subset of the dependencies term.
What are some cases where someone would reason about a dependency node modules as a lib instead of a dependency?
Dependency is a really, really broad term, and I don't remember off the top of my head what dependencies could be other than like things that you install via a system like node modules or Bower or JSR, but there's like conceptual dependencies and then technical dependencies. Oh, right. The term dependencies is already used by package JSON. There's dependencies and dev dependencies and peer dependencies, but like your dependencies with soft D dependencies might not be declared in your package JSON. It might be in some other tool like Bower back in the day. So lib is, as a term, might not be as precise as node modules, but it is more accurate because node modules does not encompass everything someone might want from this.
I see. I guess what I really like is that when you have a tsconfig.json, it's a JSON C file. And so the nice thing is it actually just gives you little comments to understand these things. However, for skip libcheck, I have a bone to pick, man, because the comment there, the quote unquote clarifying comment, is it says skip type checking.d.ts files that are included with TypeScript. That's what it says. Skip. Or no, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. Sorry, that's skip default libcheck. It says skip type checking all .d.ts files. Which that's for me, I'm like, no, but what?
That's
what if it's
bug.
my .d.ts files?
Tejas.
Right. Oh, open source.
Yeah,
we can help
you tell
someone
me what's the right thing to do in this case.
Well, I'd put the great Josh Goldberg definition, right? Skip type checking in node modules or of libs or of dependencies. Or you could do all three. You could literally do skip type checking for and then node modules or libs or dependencies, and then you just let the developer figure it out. Ooh. Anyway, maybe I won't fix it, maybe you won't fix it, but a listener, we can inspire someone's open source contribution.
I'm trying
to
to pressure you into filing a GitHub issue, but if a listener files a GitHub issue, that's also awesome and great to me. Yes. I
could file an issue and then co-fix it with a listener. Whoa. Provided it doesn't get fixed first. Awesome. Hey, thanks. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit and talk about being open source full time. Oh my gosh, Josh, you may or may not have noticed, but I'm an immigrant. I've been an immigrant my entire life. Literally, like I lived in the country of my birth for 2 years. That's it. And so, as an immigrant, it's super difficult to like not have a job and a stable income. Now I did start a consultancy in 2023. I ran it all of 2023. It was very great, but like you won't believe my own internal barriers to entry to this. Like I talked myself out of it like 1,500 times, until my wife was like, "Bro, it's okay. My family has a house. Like we'll never be homeless. You just go live with them." And I was like, that's kind of comforting. And that's actually what like gave me the courage to do it. You've been living just as a full-time open source maintainer. Whoa. That sounds like, for me, like my immigrant mind cannot comprehend that, right? Because I know open source doesn't pay as much as it should. I know you live in the northeast of the United States, so Boston, and I have to assume the cost of living is not the same as somewhere like Berlin. And so what are some challenges? What are some I guess the advantages are you get to work on things you love and care for and have a strong passion about. But can we speak to sort of the geist, the feeling, the ethos around that?
I'm not an immigrant myself, but my parents were. So I like to say I have like secondhand immigrant mentality. For those who aren't watching a video of this, I'm extremely white. Like I am within the top echelon of privilege in the United States, which we need. I think one should recognize as a factor in whether one feels comfortable doing very risky financial decisions. But yeah, I earned a lot of money in my yuppie, cushy tech jobs. At Microsoft, every time Satya doesn't do something right, like every time Microsoft messes up AI, I get worried about my stocks still. And then I earned a lot at Codecademy, which got bought out right after I left, which is amazingly good in coincidental timing. So I do have fallback. I can't retire. Like I don't have that much money, but I have enough that if open source doesn't work out, I can just go get a job. It's not a stressful environment. So that was how I got into it, knowing that, hey, this is what I love and this is what I want to do. I actually think I can benefit the world and have a great time doing it. But also, it's not a risk. I'm not risking anything by doing this.
Awesome. So part of having a job, as you know, since you worked at Microsoft and Codecademy, is, I don't know, I feel like routine comes with it. More so if it's an office, I think less so if it's remote. And I think part of it is because when it's remote, you're like working from home and the boundary between is this work time, is this home time can blur, right? Some people will work through the night at home because I'm at home. But either way, having a job brings some routine. When you're just doing open source full time, I feel like that becomes somewhat difficult to have a routine, to get up and quote unquote go to work every day. What does that look like? Do you find yourself doing odd hours? Do you find yourself like waking up in the middle of the night going like, I wonder if somebody replied to this issue?
I try not to. It was more at the beginning. I think I've gotten fairly good at forcing myself into a regimen because I really want to be healthy, and having good work-life separation, being able to time, pre-cooking your meals if you're doing meal prep or going to the gym kind of plays hand in hand with having good working hours. Also, I'm married and I want a good relationship with my spouse, not a non-existent bad one. But yeah, it's tough. In some ways, it's much harder because you don't have a boss, a manager, a mentor, peers, any of that. You just have yourself and randos on the internet.
Yeah, I feel like it could go either way, right? Either you're just like, I'm not doing anything because I don't feel motivated today for whatever reason, or I'm going to go nuts and spend the next 3 days working on this trait. So I don't know. I feel like in your shoes, I would find it somewhat challenging to cultivate balance. What has worked for you? Is it just being really, really strict with yourself and setting alarms
My
for things?
default state is to work. It's a problem. I recognize it. There's a term for it. But I try to be strict with myself for stopping working when it's dinner time, or it's soon to be dinner time, or the weekend. I try not to be overly prescriptive. It's good to have those little flex points. Actually, Clark Sell, your recent guest, gave me really good advice on this a long time ago of be strict, but also give yourself tolerance. We're not machines. Shout out Clark. Thanks for that. So yeah, I will generally, I'm an insomniac, have been my whole life. It's an ADHD side effect. So I will generally try to be in bed by 10 and awake at 6:30. And then I'll try to stop work by 5. Within those bounds, all hell breaks loose.
Anything goes. Yeah. We have a great episode coming out with Michelle Bakels, who has spent her literal job full time is to research developer health and prescribe texts and things. And so we shared in that episode sort of our best practices, what works well for us. And for me, it's similar. When I was self-employed, I found this really great tactic of doing deeply focused work for no more than 90 to 120 minutes. And that's it. That's my cutoff. Because I often find when you have a lot of time, that's also a lot of time for distractions, and you don't take it as seriously because you're like, yeah, I've got 8 hours. But when you put that, at least when I put that constraint on myself, I'm like, all right, all I've got is these 2 hours here. What can I do and how much can I do? And so it's so cool because it puts me so deep in the zone, and I leave my phone somewhere else and I'm just done. And after these 2 hours, like the remaining 6 hours in the day is not so much like hyper focus. It's more like let's go on Slack and help people struggling to like run Langflow or whatever. But yeah, that has been something. I just wanted to share it with you and the listeners because, as you mentioned, it is different for everybody. But I think the more options we have, like the more levers we can pull on, the better we can find what works for us. So you're an external party collaborating regularly with the TypeScript team, people who like work probably at Microsoft, probably not. What's that like, contributing as an external party? I assume there was like an onboarding process, but it's not like a formal onboarding, like a hired person to work on this, but you still probably had to sign like a contributor license agreement or something. How is the collaboration as sort of this external full-time open source third party?
If people use this pun in the schools and outside of the United States, but you know what happens when you assume, Tejas?
Yeah. I make an ass out of you and me.
There was no onboarding with TypeScript folks. I only irregularly, and it's honestly been a while, work with them. I have no one. I have open source teams that I kind of participate in. Actually, I have no one is not true. I have fellow open source people in TypeScript ESLint. I'm now with fellow folks in ESLint, a couple of people in Mocha, but there's no corporate backing behind any of this. I don't have like an agreement with TypeScript folks. I'm on good terms with quite a few of them, and then like we work together sometimes. For example, in particular, like Jake Bailey, Nathan Shively Sanders, and Andrew Branch. I will ping them. Jake's kind of my go-to. Jake, it's broken, please help guy. But I contribute to TypeScript the same way everyone else does, which is I file issues, I send pull requests, and if I'm lucky, they will be accepted and merged.
Cool. How do you balance, as the maintainer of TypeScript ESLint? I assume, again, I'm assuming, but you know what? You can't make an ass out of me because I'm already an ass. So, like, I guess that's why I assume. I assume that as the maintainer of TypeScript ESLint, there's probably two poles that you've got to balance between. And maybe this is wrong. I actually hope this is wrong. But with most open source project that I've seen, there's the pull toward technical debt and addressing it. Or it could even be documentation debt. And there's also the pull towards your community going like, hey, we need this, like add this feature. Why is it not done yet? By the way, I'm not going to pay you for it. Just do it because you're an open source maintainer. Unfortunately, that's just the state of the industry. So there's these two poles, right, that you've got to balance between. Is that the case? And if so, what are the best ways that you found that help you do that?
It's a good oversimplification. I like it. In actuality, there are quite a few different areas we're pulled in. Documentation, which is both new stuff and old stuff. Also, just kind of a general refactor of the docs is needed every year or two. There are new features to be added, new bug fixes to be fixed. There are old ones. There's kind of architectural stuff, like our big push with V8, which at time of recording is in beta, is making it a lot easier and more straightforward to do type linting. All these different competing priorities, much like at a company where you have a million different ways of making money or preparing yourself to make better money in the future. You have to balance between. Yeah, I think as with a company, it's more about percentages or kind of vague estimations of how much investment you want to put in each of them. We'll try to keep them at all above zero. Like, we're never just going to stop looking at bugs or stop looking at architecture until we're sunset as a project. But I think the one lever that we have this is really nice, which is we can mark things as, okay, if you want to go do it yourself. And that's actually an effective technique. Like right now, I've mostly started working on like V8 architecture stuff and things we need for V8 in the future. And if the community wants to fix the million gosh dang bugs and feature requests they've reported, they can go do it, and we'll find time to review it.
What's this V8 architecture stuff? This sounds really interesting. Because V8's a JavaScript engine.
It is unfortunate that V8 can refer to the engine thing and then also our version 8. But we're in beta for a new major version. It just so happens to be called V8. Sorry to disappoint, Tejas. But it is a really exciting major version. The way that you do type linting is going to be way better with it because we've unleashed this new thing called the project service, which actually uses the same APIs that VS Code and other editors use to get type info from TypeScript. So it's easier to configure. Like it gives you the same type stuff as VS Code, and it's a lot more speed optimized. So we've seen like 10 to 20% faster type linting in a lot of cases. Very excited about it. I've also seen out of memory exceptions, but
That's
it's in beta.
awesome. Yeah, especially. Yeah, but that's so cool because that's what I was just complaining about with the performance. So my ears perked up. However, I do feel like V8 is pretty not false marketing, but mismanaged marketing. Because like you tell any developer, JavaScript web developer, V8, and the mind instantly goes to the engine. And for a moment, I was very excited about this because I thought, whoa, is the engine? Because there's this proposal, right? Types as comments. And I was like, wait a second. Are we getting type annotations that are ignored in V8? But cool. Okay, version 8. Speaking of new versions, look, I think TypeScript is great. I don't actually feel any pain building with TypeScript ever. In fact, if Satisfies never came around, I probably would have been just as happy. And I will admit, I'm not, the most sophisticated developer who wishes there was a way to have these very specific types and such. So to me, TypeScript is actually fantastic. Nothing to change. With that said, what's like next for TypeScript?
It is the nature of a project or programming language that as the years go on, the things it adds seem less and less exciting on average to the end user. You get the end user stuff out quickly.
Yeah, like look at React 19, for example.
It is,
anyway,
the problem then is that it becomes harder and harder to explain to people that no, what you're doing now is actually even more exciting in many ways. And then people screw up the usage and the docs, and then the whole community gives the thing a bad name that it doesn't deserve. Like with React 19, right, Tejas?
Yeah. So yeah, what is TypeScript innovating on? What's coming to TypeScript that is going to be like?
I don't know.
Exciting.
I've kind of
new.
stopped keeping as close track to it. I know there are things. I can tell you what's exciting to me as a plugin developer, but my understanding is they're really focusing on performance. They've been doing refactors and then helping larger teams do things like isolated declarations. But that's you really should get someone from the TypeScript team on here.
Right.
Like they're fantastic people to talk to.
Oh, believe me, Orta Theroux. I've got my eye on you, and that totally rhymes. Anyway,
yeah.
Orta is just a great guy. I think he's so cool and he's so active in the space. In your recent talk that I got the privilege of watching at Cascadia.js, it was of course about linting and about TypeScript, but you had a section on AI, and I find this interesting because like now everyone's talking about it. What do you think? Sort of maybe top contour very crudely the intersection of AI with something like TypeScript
AI is a very
like.
narrow tool. It's really good at synthesizing conglomerations based on existing information. It's a global autocomplete. It doesn't create anything new. And it's awful at its job. Its success rate is shockingly low. AI is a trash tool that can be coerced into making something useful. I can't wait for AI to be good, man. It's going to be fantastic. But like, we've all seen the funny things, the like Google suggesting how many rocks do you on a daily basis. Like that, we're at the peak of inflated expectations part of the Gartner hype cycle because we all see the potential and the occasional really good use of this tool. But it needs bounds. It needs safety. It needs something that looks at, let's say, the code you've asked it to generate and tells you, no, you silly goose, this is wrong for these reasons. And existing tools like linters, type checkers, unit tests, those are really good at doing that. So the crux of my talk at Cascadia.js was saying, hey, AI is such a good idea. It's really cool. It's super unstable now. Here's how you can, whenever it generates code, run that code through these existing tools and then feed the complaints back to AI. That, I think, is a much more reliable cycle than just ChatGPT, write me a function.
So you take your errors, give them to ChatGPT, and then it gives you an answer that's maybe wrong. So then you take the answer, put it in your code base, I'm assuming it's code, you get more errors, and just recursively do this with AI until the problem goes away.
The demo app I showed, which is open source on Google, open source on GitHub, I guess also on Google, is just in nice. Isolation. I asked like a standard leak code question, like find me the biggest number in an array. And then I run the generated answer through lint type check test and feed any complaints back to the AI to tell the AI to improve the code until all three of those things pass.
This sounds like a nice agentic workflow where an AI will just like recursively fix itself and then give you. I actually built something similar to this. There's a company called Keel that has a schema language that nobody knows. And so I just, using exactly that approach, helped created a custom GPT with OpenAI that can teach people how to use that. Oh, look, you have a cat. For those catching us on audio, he's got a cat.
Yes.
It's a black cat. Does that mean bad luck? It does. Josh, listen, I wanted to get your thoughts on one more thing, and then I think we can start to wrap up. And this thing is very important because we have lots of listeners who join us from all over the world, and I think the question on most people's minds is how sustainable is a career as an open source maintainer? And we sort of alluded to this a lot. You mentioned it's challenging and so on, but if somebody, assuming immigrant, right? Assuming like someone in India. Actually, I recently met my good friend Akansha Doshi, who's one of the maintainers of Excalibur. I think you know her. She's just absolutely fantastic. So she's also trying. So she's living now like you, like an open source maintainer. And truth be told, I don't think she'll mind me sharing. She's finding it somewhat challenging, as even you've said. The question is, do you think at the end of this there will be a job, or is it actually like long-term sustainable? And if no, what are some ways the listeners, me, the industry can help make this sustainable? I will mention we also talked with Chad Whitaker from Sentry. As I mentioned, there's some great ideas there. But if you could wave a magic wand, right, and fix the sustainability of the full-time open source maintainer, what would you do? I love
a good magic wand question. It's an idea that I haven't had time to do anything with. I want a restaurant health grade equivalent for company open source sponsorships. I want there to be a societally agreed upon standard saying, if you pass this bar of, say, time and or money spent on open source, you get an A versus a B or C or D or F. And I want that to be so ubiquitous that people, when there's a reasonable job market, factor that into the decision of whether they want to talk to or even accept a job from a company.
That's so cool.
I put a lot of thought into this.
Some thought into this. In I don't know if, yeah, we in Germany we have something called the Nutri score. I don't know if you have this in the US, but it's like A, B, C, D, E. A is green and good. E is like, this is not food, this is poison. And when you, in the grocery store, like you said, it's super ubiquitous. Like you buy ice cream, and if it's like high protein, like good ice cream, with like, whole food ingredients and so on, it'll have a score of C, for example, because it's ultimately still fat and sugar. This for companies specifically around hiring, I think is so cool. Like an open source score. I can already think of companies that would create such a specification. Companies like thanks.dev or even Sentry. There's a few like leading the charge. I think that would be so cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that and for the discussion. Okay, the last thing I want to do, and it's the most special by far, is you and I both know that you tell some really, truly horrible jokes. Just like the worst. You know where I'm going with this. Like just absolute, like I wish I've never heard them. Sometimes I wish I was an octopus so I could like facepalm 8 times. Sometimes with these jokes, Josh, I cringe so hard that my skin turns inside out. You know the one I'm talking about. Will you share it with the listeners on mass?
The context for this joke is I saw a van. Oh, my cat just failed to jump on the desk. Hang on. He has separation anxiety.
His cat's like causing chaos. Yeah. It's a very
so the context for this joke is I saw a van branded Nixon Plumbing, and I thought, that's funny that someone would have the name Nixon, 50 whatever years after Richard Nixon. Anyway, did you hear about the time that former U.S. President Richard Nixon worked in a restaurant? Yeah, no, apparently he was quite good. He mostly did front of house, like host, waitstaff. They offered him a spot in the kitchen to be out of the public eye, to do food prep. But he declined, saying, "I am not a cook."
Still not funny, but the overemphasized volume was actually surprised me. There's the yelling. He got super angry about it. Apparently, I am not a cook. Listen, Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, you came on here with your huge technical acumen, talking about from the K in your middle name to actual like technical expertise, right? Like compiler theory and ASTs and code mods and the internals of ESLint. What I learned so much. I learned the difference in architecture between how TypeScript looks at all files, the ESLint looks at one file. I truly, deeply understand things in a new level, and I want to take this moment and thank you on behalf of myself, all the listeners, for sharing this and really, truly enhancing my understanding of these things,
Well, hey, man,
as well as the listeners. Thank you so much.
I genuinely enjoy every time we talk. Even though you make fun of my Nixon joke, which I maintain is a fantastic joke in person if someone knows who Nixon is. This was a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll let the listeners decide about the joke. Thanks again. Thank you for joining my discussion with Josh Goldberg. I hope you're as inspired as I am, and I hope you dive into the things we discussed, like abstract syntax trees, language transformations, language servers, maybe even write your own ESLint plugin. I hope you feel empowered to do that, and I hope your imposter syndrome, if any, has been diminished. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd invite you to leave up to a 5-star review. That'd be super helpful for the podcast and help people discover it, if indeed it is deserving of that. I said up to a 5-star review because if you think it deserves 1 star, then I won't hold it against you. If you're listening or watching on YouTube, then if you'd subscribe to the channel, like the video, and even maybe leave a comment with some feedback, criticism, or even ideas for future episodes or guests you'd like me to have, I'd very much welcome that. This is a dialogue and it's for you, not for me. So I look forward to hearing from you. Hey, thanks so much for sticking around, and thank you for being a part of the podcast. Most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.